Jones for his presentation on the Wolverines versus the Wildcat stand, a battle over the barn top bleachers. How are you, Chris?
I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Good. Good to see you again, too.
Likewise. Likewise.
All right, Chris, are you ready with your slides and ready to do that?
I am.
I don't understand.
Let me see if I can share my screen here. And
okay. Yep. There you go. You can full screen that if you would like, and but you're there.
Let's see. Well, I'm having trouble with the full screen, but if that works for everybody,
That works. That's fine. They're very visible.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Like Peter said, my name is Chris Jones, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak as a part of the Fred conference again this year. This is my second time presenting. The first was a couple of years ago, which was the first or the last Fred that we've had in person. And while I certainly look forward to seeing everyone in Cooperstown again soon, I do want to take this opportunity and thank Peter and Bob and everyone else that had a hand in organizing this virtual conference, because I know that's not a small undertaking. And I think we've had a fantastic conference to this point, and speakers have been fantastic. And I do feel a little bit as I'm getting ready to present as one of the last presentations for the conference, I feel a little bit like the reliever that's been called out of the bullpen when the starter's been pulled with a no-hitter. And I think Peter's just handed me the ball as my manager and told me to not screw it up. So I will do my best in that respect. But just a little bit about me before I get started. I've been a member of SABR for about 6 years, have contributed to a number of the publications in that period of time, and have really enjoyed it as a way to stay connected with the game. I got drafted out of high school by the Toronto Blue Jays, and in a round that I'll say no longer exists, and made the decision that if I was good enough, I would get drafted again out of college. And I now work as an attorney, if that gives you any indication of how that decision worked out for me. But just finally, I'd like to thank my wife and 4 kids for putting up with me getting ready for this presentation. I have found that one benefit of the virtual format was the elimination of the dual tracked presentations, primarily because I haven't had to worry about whether she would choose the other presentation instead of mine. But without further ado, I'm here to talk about a dispute between the Detroit Wolverines and a landowner who owned property adjoining Recreation Park in the mid-1880s. And there are a couple of things that drew my attention to this topic to talk about. And the first of which is, in my law practice, I deal with property issues quite often. I see neighbors who don't get along with on a fairly regular basis. And there's one thing that can certainly be said, as we'll see here today, is that the Detroit Wolverines and John Depper Jr. Definitely did not get along. The second thing that drew my attention to this particular topic is just the number of forums and the length of time that the dispute went on. The little bit of research that's been done on this topic to date has focused on what I would call the high point or flash point of the dispute, and that's the opinion that came out of the Michigan Supreme Court, which we'll talk about. But there was quite a bit of buildup prior to the arrival at the Supreme Court, and then, believe it or not, the fight did not stop when the Supreme Court came down with their decision. And so ultimately, I'd like to talk about 3 main things today. And the first is just who was involved in the dispute and where did it happen. Second, we'll talk about the history of this issue, both inside and outside of the courtroom and the interaction of the parties. And finally, I'll just touch briefly on the impact that this case had on Wildcat stand issues that followed. But moving first to the first slide here, you see a map of the city of Detroit. And I have a photo credit that you can't see there very well on the bottom, but it's to the Detroit Historical Society. And before I get too far along and forget, I'd like to publicly thank them and Jeremy Dimmick, who works for the DHS specifically, for helping providing this map and some other photographs that you'll see as we go along here in the presentation.
Hey, Chris, we're still seeing your original slide, the very first one, so it's not moving along.
Nope. Still stuck on one slide here?
Yep, still stuck on the first one. You might want to unshare and then try to reshare again and see if that works.
How's that?
Nope, still see the first one here. Can you do a slideshow and play from current slide, see if that works?
Yeah, it's.
Oh, now we see the second one.
How's that?
Yep, we see the second one now.
Okay, third time or whatever time's the charm here. But this is a map of the city of Detroit, roughly about 1891, which is a few years after the issue with John Depper Jr. and the Wolverines, but pretty close. And if you're not familiar with the city of Detroit, its geography, as I was not in preparing for this, Recreation Park sat approximately where I've noted on the red star. And just for context, the future Bennett Park and Tiger Stadium was down to the southwest, and Comerica Park almost due south of where Recreation Park was located. And I've zoomed in on that map so you can see Recreation Park just a little bit better. And as you can see, it's quite a large location. It was built in 1879, was the home of the Detroit Wolverines from 1881 to 1888. It was built as a multi-site use or multi-use site. You can see cricket grounds to the north. It's bounded by Harper Hospital there to the west. And I have a number of photographs that I thought were interesting. This is a photograph of the.
Let me just interrupt again. Chris, it didn't advance. You're still on the city of Detroit map,
Well,
but your blow up of the Recreation Park area didn't advance. Monica Nutriot says, enable editing and put in slide. She recommends enable editing and put in slideshow mode.
I'm in slideshow mode here. Not
that
sure.
the yellow bar at the top.
Oh, I got you.
That might do the trick.
Okay.
There you have it.
And do we see things advancing now?
There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Much better.
Enable editing did the trick. We'll hope. We'll
Thank
stop
you,
me
Monica.
again.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you very much. Well, I've highlighted in blue where you can see Recreation Park, and Brady Street is just to the south, if you can see my cursor. And the entrance, this photograph shows the entrance to the park, quite an ornate entrance and facility that they had there. I also have a photograph here that I thought was particularly interesting because you can see the half-mile dirt track and the sign denoting that. This photograph I like a lot for purposes of this presentation. For one, you can see a baseball game ongoing, but if you look just behind the right field bleachers, there are what appears to be Wildcat stands behind the fence. And as we'll talk about here today, John Depper Jr. is the individual that the team appeared to target and focus on in their efforts to stop the Wildcat stands, but he was certainly not the only one taking advantage of the baseball games and the ability to make a few bucks to sell views to the game. This next photograph has a number of interesting components. It's quite a crowded facility. There's a little bit of dispute of when this photograph was taken. I think the consensus is that it was in 1886 in June 8th to be exact. There was a crowd estimated on that date of over 10,000 people. But you can see the horses and buggies in the foreground. And for purposes of this presentation, if you look just beyond the bleachers on the first base side, you see something sticking up there that is unlike anything else. And based on what we know of the location of John Depper's property and his barn and his bleachers, it's certainly believed that this is John Depper's Wildcat stand right there in the background. And we'll talk more about that Wildcat stand here in a moment, but first I want to introduce you to John Depper Jr. himself. He was listed as a carpenter in the Detroit City Directory, and his father, John Depper Sr., was actually killed in a railroad accident in 1888 while working for the Detroit, Grand Haven, and Milwaukee Railway. He was cleaning out some passenger cars and was killed by a passing train. But upon John Depper Sr.'s death, it was said that he reported that he owned considerable property surrounding Recreation Park that was worth approximately $20,000. And so while the historical record's not completely clear on why the Wolverines chose John Depper to go after to stop the Wildcat stand problems they were having, I think it's a reasonable assumption that they selected the son of a fairly prominent landowner in the area and thought that anything that they could do to John Depper would everyone else would follow suit. The barn on which Depper would ultimately build his Wildcat stand was first in the news in 1883, and it actually had nothing to do with baseball. But in January of that year, a barn at the southwest corner of Leland and Beaubien Street, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, burned to the ground. And that's the property that was owned by John Depper Jr. And a two-story barn that was on the property at the time burned, and all 6 horses that were housed there were killed. Now, fortunately, the residence that was attached to the barn was saved, and it was said that the origin of the fire was unknown, but the cause was thought to be an incendiary. It didn't take long for Depper to rebuild, as he got a permit to rebuild the barn within just a couple of months. And within a short time after that, he had his Wildcat stand up and running. Now, the Wildcat stand in particular was quite an operation that Mr. Depper put together. He had constructed steps leading up to the roof of the barn so that people could more easily access the seating area. The occupancy, the occupancy was between 25 and 100 people, although as we'll see, Mr. Depper made every effort to squeeze any patron on top of his barn that wanted to be there. He charged between 10 and 15 cents for admission, which was quite a bit less than the roughly 50 cents per ticket that the Detroit Wolverines were charging. And it was even reported that he sold refreshments from time to time to make the games more enjoyable for his patrons. Now, undoubtedly, this was a very annoying, to say the least, turn of events for the Wolverines, and we know that the Wolverines were having financial difficulty, which only increased over the course of time. And so they made the decision that they were going to stop the Wildcat stand problems and start with John Depper at that. And to their credit, they didn't start by going to the courts, but they, what I'll call pre-litigation attempts to stop Depper. And the Wolverines tried to take matters into their own hands. And the first thing that they did to try to stop Depper's stand from being functional was simply to raise the fence by 10 feet, not necessarily all the way around Recreation Park, but just in the area of where Depper's stand was. And what I think is interesting, if we, well, talk about that in a minute, but Depper was not dissuaded by the 10 feet raised fence. He simply built his stand a little bit higher. And so the team moved to what I would call phase 2 and decided that they would try to attach canvas screens to telephone poles to try to block the view. And if you look back at the picture that we saw just a few moments ago, what I think is interesting is if you look in front of the stand area, what appears to be canvas screens, and I've highlighted them in yellow here so you can see them hopefully a little bit better, but it appears that those are canvas screens intended to block the view of the Wildcat stand. Now you can see that Depper's stand are not blocked hardly to any extent by those screens. And so you can guess, just as his response to the raised fence was to build a stand higher, when the canvas screens were attached, he went higher still. And this was a continuing attempt by Depper to get around the attempts by the Wolverines to stop his view, and he kept on rolling just as he was before. The last, third and final attempt that the Wolverines took to try to stop Depper before appealing to the courts was to get a third party involved. They called the building inspector. And the building inspector, the goal of the team in calling them was to attempt to get the stand condemned. And we've seen Wildcat stand issues where they're not necessarily built with the most sturdy materials. They're not built for safety. They certainly don't comply with any codes that we know of in current days. And so the building inspector was called out, but Depper, to his credit, was able to strengthen his stand. He satisfied all of the requirements that the building inspector attempted to put upon him. And so the Wolverines were sort of back where they started. They have a Wildcat stand issue. Their attempts to stop it without going to the courts had failed. And so what ensued was what I'll call 3 rounds of civil litigation. You could say it's a 3-game series of civil litigation. And the first of which was the most simple and straightforward and quickest. The team filed for an injunction. And we'll talk about each of these in more detail here in a moment. But as we'll see, round 2 was an appeal. There was a motion to dissolve the injunction and a motion for contempt. And then round 3 was the Michigan Supreme Court. But in, we'll call round 1, when the Wolverines sought an injunction in August of 1885, they went to the Detroit Superior Court and asked them to shut down the Wolverines, shut down the Depper stand. And their argument in this regard was very simple, that Depper just had no right to view the games for free or to allow others to do so. And Depper's argument was also very simple, if not very believable. He told the court that the air around his barn was impure, and so that he had a right and needed to operate his stand so that he could get where it was fresh and cool up above his barn. And as you might guess, the court gave that argument about as much consideration as was warranted, and did issue an injunction shutting down Depper's Wildcat stand. And so the Wolverines take round 1, or game 1, of this 3-game series. But it didn't take long for John Depper to appeal that decision. In fact, his attorney filed a motion to dissolve the injunction, and immediately ran to the other judges in the Detroit Superior Court, not Judge Chipman, who had issued the injunction, who was unavailable to hear the matter at that time, but he attempted to get the other judges in the court to dissolve the injunction for him. When they refused to do so, Depper was forced to wait until Judge Chipman returned to have his motion to dissolve the injunction heard. By that time, Depper had quite a few more things to worry about than just whether or not he could continue operating his stand, because Depper had decided not to obey the injunction. And in fact, the team was able to present 3 affidavits to the court of individuals who claimed that they had paid 10 cents to Depper to see a game at Recreation Park at his Wildcat stand since the time that the injunction had been issued. And so, in addition to setting a hearing on the motion to dissolve the injunction, Judge Chipman also set a hearing on whether to hold John Depper in contempt of court for violating his prior order. And at this stage, you have to think that the team is feeling pretty good. They just had a win getting the injunction. They have a contempt proceeding going against John Depper. But as sometimes happens in court, things don't turn out the way that you think. And sometimes when you read a legal opinion, as Judge Chipman issued after the hearing for the motion to dissolve the injunction and the motion for contempt, sometimes even before you get to a court's ruling or their analysis or conclusion, there's a statement that, if you're on the wrong side of it, just kind of makes you say, I know where this is going. And there was just that kind of a statement in this case when he said that whether or not Depper ought to continue operating his stand is a question of morals. And much to the team's chagrin, I'm sure the hearing focused less on Depper's refusal to obey the injunction and more on the legal rights of the parties. And if I'm the attorney for the team, I sort of have a pit in my stomach when I hear it's a question of morals, because it certainly appears that it's laying the groundwork for the court saying that it's not a legal question that they can get involved in or shut down. And that's definitely the direction that Judge Chipman went down. And he did make a point, although he ultimately dissolved the injunction, make sure that everyone knew his real opinion of the Wildcat stand was, because he concluded his opinion with this sentence. He said, "It may be a meanness to make money at the expense of the exhibitions given by his neighbors, but I know of no power in a court of chancery to restrain every meanness." And so, as I mentioned, Judge Chipman dissolved the injunction. He dismissed the motion for contempt, and his statement led to the later publication and headline in the Detroit Free Press that Depper's stand was mean but legal. And so round two, or game two, of this dispute went to John Depper Jr., and we proceeded there. And so the team had a decision to make there. Of course, they could continue to let Depper operate his stand, or they could appeal to the Michigan Supreme Court, and they immediately filed their appeal. And interestingly, they developed their argument quite substantially, as you might expect from the initial seeking of an injunction to when they got to the Michigan Supreme Court. And by the time that the Michigan Supreme Court heard the case and ruled, it was April of 1886. Know that by the time the team had purchased the Buffalo Club, they had taken on considerable additional salary, and their financial status was going nowhere fast. And so they testified and offered testimony that their expenses were roughly $3,000 a month, and that they relied almost exclusively on ticket sales in order to meet those obligations. And they also had evidence to the court that they had used every reasonable means outside of litigation to try to stop Depper. But that had not worked. And Depper had also developed his argument a little bit, but he mainly focused on what the appellate court had just said, that he admitted to operating the stand, but that it was perfectly legal. And then he made another one of his, what I would call creative arguments, when he said that it was actually the team's use of Recreation Park that it prohibited his quiet enjoyment of his property. They were the ones that were actually bothering him because people were constantly trespassing onto his property to chase balls. And he claimed he had to repeatedly break up fights on his property of intoxicated patrons. We'll see that the intoxicated patrons were just as likely to have been on top of Depper's barn as they were patrons of Recreation Park, but nonetheless, that's the argument that he put forth. The Supreme Court relied on three primary things to rule in John Depper's favor. The first is they said that the team had not shown they had any exclusive right from the legislature, the city charter or bylaws, or city council to the use of Recreation Park or to the viewing of games at Recreation Park, whether on the property or off. Secondly, they said the team didn't establish that they had any right to control the use of Depper's property. And finally, he said that there was no showing that Depper's customers would have purchased tickets from the Wolverines and attended Recreation Park if Depper's stand had been shut down. Now, practically, we know that undoubtedly some of those people likely would have attended Recreation Park, but the team couldn't provide any evidence to prove it. And so for the three reasons that are listed there and that I've gone over, the team was denied by the Supreme Court. And the court concluded with a quote that said they couldn't limit the extent up or down to which a man may enjoy his property. And as long as he doesn't interfere with the rights of his neighbor, he subjects himself to no liability. And so the result is Depper wins again. and this time at the Michigan Supreme Court, and takes the 3-game series, if we were to consider it that way. And the team once again has to make a decision. They have financial difficulties. That has not changed. They have Wildcat stand issues. That hasn't changed, but they have a legal ruling that says they can't shut them down by a court of law. And so the team, in the fashion of the way this argument had transpired, decided to continue fighting, irrespective of the Supreme Court opinion. And in fact, it was reported that their initial response, they considered placing a fully rigged sailing ship along the boundary of the property and just raising the sails before each game. And it's not clear whether that ever happened. But what is clear is that they returned to the building inspector, and I'll say the building inspector returns. And really what the team did was focus on the legal ruling of the courts, both the Supreme Court and the appellate court, in saying that Depper had a legal right to do what he was doing. So they went about attacking that legal right and the basis for the operation in general. And the building inspector, interestingly, with respect to the timing, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in April of 1886, and it was only a month later, in May, that the building inspector decided they should go inspect not only the grandstands of Recreation Park, but while they were at it, undoubtedly with some prompting from the team, they decided to inspect the Wildcat stands surrounding Recreation Park as well. And unsurprisingly, it was determined that Depper had some deficiencies. The inspector notified the city attorney that he would be making a complaint against him, and also made a complaint against an adjoining landowner, just so it wouldn't be misconstrued as it was fairly punitive in the timing, as it would see, as you can see. Depper was able to satisfy the inspectors and operate through the course of 1886, but in May of 1887, the inspector returned again, and this time Depper had failed to comply with an ordinance that required that he get a certificate of the safety of his stand before operating. And when the inspector showed up at the stand during the course of a game, it was reported that the stands were full and they were in the process of raising a wooden plank to attach to the stand and extend the number of people that could be there. When the inspector tried to stop these things, the patrons were said to throw him down from the stand, and the inspector ultimately retreated, but not without notifying the police of the situation. And ultimately an arrest warrant was issued for John Depper Jr., and he was arrested on a charge of operating an insecure structure which was dangerous to human life. And so that's why I say we had a different kind of courtroom that John Depper entered. It was a criminal court, and he was arraigned and pled not guilty, but the court disagreed and fined him $100 or 60 days in the House of Correction. The court noted that Depper's case was a good one to make an example out of, and that's why they thought it justified the $100 fine, which was the most allowable under the statute. Sensing a high point of leverage over Depper, the club offered him $100 to settle and remove his stand, which of course would cover the fine that he was just issued. But Depper, keeping in the spirit of the dispute, demanded $200 and immediately appealed the court's ruling. During the time of the appeal, he continued to operate his stand, and in fact, the canvas screens that the team had raised were continually being raised again to such a height that the inspectors had to order that they be more securely attached. Within 3 months, or 3 months later, the appeal of Depper's guilty verdict was heard, and by that time, the prosecution couldn't produce any witnesses who would testify that Depper himself had actually controlled the stand on the day that the inspector was present. Now, it was unquestioned and undisputed that Depper owned the property and that he operated the stand in general, but nobody would testify on the prosecution's behalf that Depper himself controlled things on that day. And for that reason, the court remanded the case with the instruction to dismiss the fine and issue a ruling for Depper. So with one loss after another piling up on the Wolverines, we say peace at last. In the spring of 1888, the parties decided to stop fighting, and Depper did agree to settle and in for payment of $300. And it's very likely that the party saw the writing on the wall with the end of situation of the Wolverines. We know they were short-lived after this anyway. Bennett Park had been constructed. But either way, the years-old feud had finally been settled. And I think it could be said that in the case of the Wolverines versus the Wildcat stand was victorious. So just to touch briefly on some Wildcat stand issues that followed. Excuse me, this is a photograph of Bennett Park, and you can see the Wildcat stand stands there behind the left field wall. This was a continual issue both there and at League or Boulevard Park that based on the ruling in the Depper case, the teams knew they had no legal recourse to try to stop. And so they resorted to city ordinances to try to assert or require $25 per day license fees for the operation of a stand. There was interestingly, a local attorney that owned a Wildcat stand surrounding the park, and he testified that he only cleared about $3 a day in the operation of the stand during the season. So a $25 a day license fee obviously effectively would shut down stands. But the court, in a suit that was filed in 1905, reaffirmed that the Wildcat these are screens. You can press a photograph of them at Bennett Park. And there's another photograph here. This is the 1909 World Series. And if you see to the right of your screen, behind the left field wall, those same screens appear to be visible right there, still in 1909. Obviously, Shibe Park or Connie Mack Stadium is known for its rooftop seats, right field wall, and the Connie Mack fence was what was required to put a stop to that. And then finally, probably maybe the most famous rooftop seats of all at Wrigley Field. This is an early photograph of those. Of course, those have been the subject of litigation over the course of time, and now we have big, beautiful video boards to look at instead of the lovely rooftop seats. But that is all that I have. I thank everybody for allowing me to speak. I really enjoyed it, and appreciate again putting on this conference virtually. I think it was fantastic. So thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much. Perfectly organized. Love the graphics, love the images, love the comparisons. Richard Hirschberger noted that he thinks that the earliest reference to a spike fence might be this reference to Detroit. That might, of course, it came into other usage later with Connie Mack, like you said. And I had at one of our Connie Mack chapter meetings, which I was attending, they had an old man who was in his, it was an elderly man, I'm getting there myself, elderly man in his 90s, who was a boy whose father owned one of those houses behind the right field wall in outside of Shibe Park. And Shibe Park then, and very interesting his recollections of it. You got a couple of other things. You want to look at some of the chat stuff that went back and forth. Somebody asked, was there ever any compensation? Maury asked that, and Bruce Alteris said, "Is this an early version of lawfare? In other words, was this a version of who had the deeper pockets?"
Well, it's interesting. Deppert had legal counsel. He wasn't representing himself. So at a minimum, he was able to obtain representation. So if the team's thought was to try to bleed him dry, Deppert might have had the upper end on that based on what we know of his father and the adjoining property and the value that had and the financial condition of the Wolverines. I don't know about if that's the first mention of the spike fence, but it very well could have been. It's certainly the same type of situation.
Well, if I ever need a lawyer in Texas, I know who to look for. Which I hope I don't. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.